goes up. Well, Brother Koenig is a tough act to follow, so I'll have to do my best. But I was reminded I committed myself to do a joke today. So I've got to do the joke. A mere formality, I assure you. You want a Catholic joke or a Jewish joke? Both. I'll do the Catholic joke first. So Winston Churchill dies and he comes to the pearly gates and St. Peter says, "Sir Winston, before I can let you in, I've got to ask you a question. When you were alive on the earth down in number 10 Downing Street, did you ever commit adultery?" And he said, "I never betrayed Lady Churchill." St. Peter said, "The finest limousine we have is a Rolls Royce. As soon as I open the pearly gates, drive through, keep going till you get to heaven." Off he goes. JFK comes, and St. Peter says, "Before I can let you in, I've got to ask you a question. When you were alive down on the earth, did you ever commit adultery in the White House?" And he said, "Well, there was this movie star named Marilyn." I said, "Yeah, we read about that in the tabloids. Listen, it's not quite a Rolls Royce, but it's a beautiful Cadillac, second best car we have. As soon as I open the door, jump in the Cadillac, drive through the pearly gates and follow the Rolls Royce, keep going till you get to heaven." Charles de Gaulle dies. St. Peter says, "Charles de Gaulle, before I can let you in, I've got to ask you this question. When you were alive on the earth in the Élysée Palace, did you ever commit adultery?" "Oh, Monsieur Saint-Pierre, I'm French, and of course, from time to time," I should have known. Look, it's not a limousine, but get in that Peugeot, French car. When I open the pearly gates, drive through. Follow the Cadillac that's following the Rolls Royce, keep going till you get to heaven." Meanwhile, Nikita Khrushchev dies. St. Peter says, I shouldn't even bother asking you, Nikita, but when you were alive on the earth down in the Kremlin, did you ever commit adultery? Khrushchev said, "Every day." St. Peter said, "I knew it. All right, look, it's not even a car, but it's the best I can do. Get on that bicycle. When I open the pearly gates, pedal through and keep cycling. Just keep pedaling, follow that line of cars, keep going till you get to heaven." Churchill's driving and he sees in his mirror Kennedy following him, beeps and he pulls over. They're having a chat. And Charles de Gaulle joins them and they're talking over old times and so forth. And they see in the distance somebody coming on a bicycle. They say, "Looks like Khrushchev." And he's laughing hysterically. And he's pedaling and he's laughing and he's pedaling and he's laughing and he's pedaling and he's laughing. Finally, he catches up to them. They said, "What's so funny?" "I just passed the Pope on a skateboard." You know about the priest and the rabbi who lived next door to each other in Brooklyn? There was a big mud puddle in front of their houses. The rabbi was parked there, and the priest pulled in, splashed mud all over the rabbi's car. What am I going to do? This is going to be horrible for interfaith relations. I better wash his car. So he goes out and he's scrubbing the rabbi's car, and the rabbi looks out the window and sees him doing it. Half hour later, the priest hears a strange, terrible grinding noise. And he looks out the window, and a rabbi is attacking the fender of his car with an electric buzzsaw. The priest runs out and says, "What are you doing, Rabbi?" "You baptized my car, I'm circumcising yours." That's enough of that. Turn with me, please, to the book of Daniel, chapter 2. Commencing, please, in verse 40. "Then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron. Inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so the iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partially of potter's clay and partially of iron, it'll be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. And as the toes of the feet were partially of iron and partially of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and some brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay. They will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. And in the days of those kings, the King of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. But it will itself endure forever, inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron and the clay, the silver, the gold. The great God has made known to the king what things would happen in the future. The iron and the clay. I recall when I was first saved, and I must agree with what the previous speakers have said. When I was first saved, the talk was the late great Planet Earth and other such books. Some of the books about the return of Christ and eschatology were oversimplified. Some were good, some were not good. But at least people were talking about it and Christians were thinking about it. Now we are more than 30 years closer to the return of Christ, and there's far less interest in it. The fact that there is less interest in eschatology now than there was 30 years ago is a deception in itself. The increase in replacement theology is part of the deception. The ecumenical movement is part of the deception. Had you asked me 30 years ago why I believed it was the last days, I would have certainly pointed to events in the Middle East, the regathering of Israel. I would have also pointed to the fact that even then we saw a conspicuous number of Jews coming to faith in Christ. Romans 11 says Jews would again be grafted in the last days. The fact that you see more Jewish believers in Jesus now than any time since the 2nd century in itself is a sign of the last days, that the time of the Gentiles is coming to an end. Remember, Revelation tells us what Romans 11 tells us. The first Christians were Jews, and the last Christians will be Jews. The first Christians were Jews, and the last Christians will be Jews. I would have talked about those things. I would have also pointed to the destruction of the environment, the trend towards the globalization of the world economy. I would have pointed to all those things. However, if you ask me now what the clearest sign of the last days is, although I would say certainly the Middle East, certainly events in Europe, certainly the globalization of the world economy, etc., I would have still say all those things, even more so now than I ever did. But the clearest sign? The clearest sign? In the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus was asked about the last days, he warned about wars one time, rumors of war one time, an increase in famine one time, an increase in pestilence one time, an increase in earthquakes, seismological activity one time, Jerusalem and Israel one time, and only in Luke's version. He warned about deception perpetrated against the elect 4 times. Jesus warned about deception in the church 4 times as much as he did anything else. In God's economy, there are 3 kinds of people: Jews, Gentiles, and believers who can be either Jew or Gentile. As far as the Jews, Satan has them deceived, not recognizing their own Messiah. As far as the nations, Satan has them deceived. Satan's the god of the world. That leaves us. He's trying to deceive believers. And deceiving believers he is. We have seen instances today that Jesus warned directly. When you see a man like Chuck Colson, who will endorse Peter Kreeft's book, that book pointed out by Roger didn't say anything. Peter Kreeft calls for ecumenical union with Islam to morally save society. Colson endorses it? And this is a respected evangelical leader. A man who was once a deceiver for Nixon is now a deceiver for Satan. There is a cancer in the body of Christ. Deception against the elect. People just don't see it. Well, they can't see it. And ultimately, God will blind their eyes so they won't be able to see it. It says in 2 Thessalonians. But we're supposed to see it. My own family being Israeli, I'm of course very concerned with Israel. When the bomb went off day before yesterday, I was on the phone first thing in the morning calling my friends and family. You all right? Absolutely. But you know, the role of Europe is almost as important in biblical prophecy, both in Daniel and in Revelation. the reconfederation of the countries in the Roman Empire, we have to understand what is happening. Point. What happened in the days of Daniel is recapitulated in the last days. A very rapid sequence of rise and fall of world empires. What happened then is a picture of what will happen in the last days. Everybody was concerned with the Assyrian Empire. They were the bad guys. They had conquered the 10 northern tribes. They were utterly pagan. They were barbarian. Everybody was afraid of these godless people. But all of a sudden, their empire imploded, as the prophet Nahum said it would. All of a sudden, it imploded. And lo and behold, on the horizon, looking over their shoulder, nobody thought about it, but you had the meteoric rise of Babylon, something much worse, much more dangerous, which would do much more damage to the people of God. The same thing happens now. When the Iron Curtain came down, people naively thought, now we have a chance for a new world order towards peace. When I was a little boy in New York during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikita Khrushchev came to New York, to the UN, took off his shoe and began pounding on the podium, "We will bury you." He had a fondness for vodka. In a matter of months, Brezhnev Suslov deposed him. "We can't have a nut with his finger on the button," said the Soviet Politburo. Read the book, The Final Days, about Nixon during the Watergate scandal when he calls the stage to be alert against the Soviets during the Yom Kippur War. He was stoned on alcohol and tranquilizers. Haig and Kissinger were trying to keep this deranged nut pushing the world to the brink of the abyss to save his neck politically. Nixon went. We can't have crazy people with his finger on the button. The Islamic mind doesn't think that way. Jihad, push the button. The only assurance of salvation in Islam is shahadi. To die a martyr, as they would call it, in a jihad. That's the assurance of salvation. Hinduism, now India has a bomb. They don't think that way in Hinduism. BHP, the Hindu, militant Hindu party in India, you'll be reincarnated, come back as a Brahmin. The Soviets were nothing. Now you're looking at an enemy much more dangerous. And in those days, the enemy was a more ancient one, dating back to the Tower of Babel. Well, Islam is the ancient enemy of Christendom. And of course, Iraq was the location of Babylon. However, overnight, Assyria goes, nobody could believe it, then there's Babylon. Lo and behold, the Media-Persians. Point. Darius comes, fulfills prophecy, sends the Jews back in fulfillment of Isaiah's predictions. Alexander the Great comes. So long, Persia. And out of the chaos that ensues comes the Roman Empire, succeeded by the Holy Roman Empire in the post-Constantinian Christian era. A very rapid series of rise and fall of world empires. That's what Daniel's day was like. The last days are the same. I live in Great Britain where my grandparents were from. If you told my grandparents the sun would set every 24 hours on the British Empire, it would have seemed ridiculous. Well, Britannia no longer rules the waves. Now it sets every 24 hours. French Empire went the same way. If you grew up in my generation under the Cold War, you remember Vietnam and the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you had said in the 1960s or the 1970s that the Soviet Union would implode, that the Berlin Wall would come down, that communism would self-destruct, it would have seemed absurd. There it goes. Okay. British Empire, French Empire, Soviet Empire. Then you have the post-World War II miracle economies. Japan is the new economic dynamo of Asia. I was in Japan last 2 years ago. It wasn't what it was 5 years ago. 4 recessions in 10 years. China is the rising star of economic dynamism in Asia. Germany. The reunification of Germany was achieved mainly by America and Britain. What was a political success, military success, an economic disaster. Germany is no longer the economic dynamo of the European Union. However, in those days, and Daniel, in the middle of all this chaos and rapid change, you had Zionism. The Jews going back to the land under Darius the Mede and under Cyrus, as prophesied by Isaiah. And so the last days are the same. The Jews go back in the midst of all these radical political changes. Doesn't matter who sees it or who doesn't, God sees it. But the Daniel tells us the conflict would ultimately come to the kings of the north and the kings of the south. In his day, it had to do with Mark Antony, Cleopatra, the conflict where Rome took over the Middle East and North Africa. Even before the Iron Curtain came down, it was obvious that the future conflict in the world would not be an east-west scenario between the capitalist world and the communist world, but between the north and south, the developed world and the developing world, and more importantly, the ancient enemy, Islam, and the developed world. The war in the Falklands was the first North-South war. The war in the Gulf was the second. Now we've had the third. These countries in the third world, if they default on their debt, you have a banking crisis in Europe, America, and Japan. They are, by and large, mineral rich, but capital and technology poor. The countries in the Northern Hemisphere are technology rich, capital rich, but resource poor, apart from America and a few other exceptions. The conflict will be between the North and South. And of course, someone came out of the Roman Empire. When you see people complaining about Israel going into Jenin, I live in England. You wouldn't believe the anti-Semitism and the media bias. I tell people, forget about Israel going into Jenin. It is only a matter of time before the British Army goes into Bradford and Birmingham, to the Islamic communities, to stop the riots in the West. After September 11, for 1 year, the Bush administration continued the express visa program, importing Saudi Arabians easily into America with no proper security clearance. If what was done after September 11th had been what was done after the battleship Maine sunk in Havana Harbor in the Spanish-American War, war would have been declared on Saudi Arabia the next day. Mexican border is permeable. Even a Hispanic can't always tell the difference between an Arab and a Hispanic. But no. Forget about deportation of immigrants from Islamic countries. I'm not talking about Americans. I'm talking about people with green cards and student visas. Bush won't do anything. Won't do anything. Not only that, but to this day, the Saudi Arabian government is financing madrasas all across the United States, but will not allow one church to be built in Saudi Arabia. Bush knows it. The Saudis hung a 15-year-old boy not long ago for becoming a Christian, while Bush's father said, the Saudis are our friends. Well, somebody who hangs a boy at 15 for putting his faith in Jesus might be a friend of Bush, but he's no friend of mine and he's no friend of America. I agree with my friend and brother Bill Koenig. Pray for Mr. Bush. I pray for George Bush every day. I don't trust him. I don't like him. I don't respect him. I think his family are a brood of political prostitutes owned by international oil, and I think his administration, you can trust him as far as you can spit. But I pray for them every day. If he's not influenced by our prayers, he'll be influenced by big oil. Big oil own and operate his administration. We're being left at risk so as not to offend the Saudis. Oh, he has no problem leaning on Israel. You can build a fence to save jobs across the Mexican border, but you can't build one to save lives in Israel. That's not a problem for him. Instead of standing up to the real dynamo of terror, which is the Wahhab of Saudi Arabia, and second the Iranians, he'll lean on Israel. Do not trust, respect, or believe that man, but pray for him. What happened in Daniel's day is what happens in the last days. Point. A rapid sequence. The British, the French, Soviets go. Point. Decline of post-war Germany, decline of post-war Japan, and then lo and behold, read Jeremiah 51. Everything from the dehydration of the marshes to the attack from the north, the Kurds, a replayed scenario. Islam will go. Point. The rebirth of the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, and it's not now. The EU was established by the Treaty of Rome as a common market. Zionism and a return to a north-south conflict. Islam has a long memory. They interpret what's happening now in light of the Crusades, in light of the Saracen invasions. It's part of the same struggle. Remember, if Israel did not exist, listen to our tapes on Israel, Islam, and prophecy. If Israel did not exist, you'd have the same problem. 55,000 dead Christians in the Philippines, 200,000 dead Christians in East Timor, 2.1 million dead Christians in Sudan. If Israel didn't exist, you'd have the same problem. The only thing Israel is guilty of is the thing that the Bush administration doesn't have the guts to do, stand up to Islam. Do not believe these naive Christians who are telling you the Republican Party is our party, is a Christian. Sandra Day O'Connor cites European precedent about the sodomy law in Texas. Did you see the Republicans on the warpath about taking the Ten Commandments out of the court? It's all politics. They manipulate naive evangelicals to thinking they're conservatives. At most, they're a lesser of evils, and sometimes I'm not even sure about that. Point. Let's see what's happening. Christum contra mundum. You have a very rapid series change now, but something comes from the fourth beast, Daniel. Something comes out of the Roman Empire. It comes out of the Roman Empire. The head of the image of Daniel was Babylon. That's the mentality of the world. You want to know the mentality of the world? It's the mind of Babylon. We can reach God and be our own God, just like the Tower of Babel. The midsection was the Persian Empire, the heart of the world. Man wants to do good, but he can't. The Persians wanted to do what was right. Darius wanted to do what was right. Cyrus wanted to do what was right, but when push came to shove, read Ezra and Nehemiah. They couldn't do it. The world may want to do right in its heart, but it can't. Then you get to the Greeks. Waist, gut, where reproductive organs are located in human anatomy. The seminal influence on Western civilization is Hellenistic. It comes from the Greeks. Then comes Rome. Strongest muscles, biggest bones in the body. You can balance a Volkswagen on an adult male femur. Musculature in the legs, strongest in the human body. Nothing could compare with Rome. What comes out of Rome is a mixture of iron and clay. Now, there were people speculating years ago, oh, there's 9 countries in the European Union, the EEC as it was called then. When one more joins, that'll be it. There are varying interpretations of this. Some people say it's 10 world trade blocks. The world is being broken up into trade blocks. Okay, you've got ASEAN, and you've got the EU, you've got NAFTA, and so forth. However we interpret it, let's understand this. It must come from what had been Greco-Roman civilization. Look at North and South America. You have mainly European Americans and Hispanic Americans. Our languages spoken in North America and Canada, the States, Portuguese, French, English, Spanish. We come from that. However, we're looking at Europe, the EU. The countries that were in the Roman Empire reconfederating into a non-democratic Europe. Notice initially, the clay is not pottery. Daniel tells us it is just raw clay. But raw clay and iron will not bond. They do not adhere to one another, so it becomes pottery. They try to sculpture it to make it stick. It becomes the mentality of the world versus the mind of Christ. You have an artificial multiculturalism. That is exactly what the Roman Empire did. It had an artificial multiculturalism. It was eclectic. They tried to incorporate all the cultures into Rome. They had no problem saying, you don't need to speak Latin, our language, we can use Greek. We'll take your gods and your religion into our pantheon. It was a political agenda facilitated by culture. It was an artificial multiculturalism. Pay attention. Jesus said, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Kingdom in Greek, basileia. Nation is in Greek ethnon. In Hebrew, malchut, for kingdom. And nation is goy. Lo isa goy le goy herev. Nation shall not raise sword against nation. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. In other words, the political conflicts of the last days will involve race. Now, I don't mean simply black and white racial hatred of the American South or something like that, or apartheid of South Africa was. No. I go to Africa next month. The hatred you'd see in Rwanda between Hutus and Tutsis, or in South Africa, the hatred you would see between Zulus and Khorzas. Yugoslavia, the hatred you'd seen between Serbs and Croats, both white. If it wasn't skin color, it'd be something else. Racial tensions increase. Iron and clay do not adhere except in here, in the body of Christ. Here, it doesn't matter what you're born. It only matters if you're born again. The wall of partition is broken down. The only formula for unity is unity in Christ, because to us it doesn't matter what you're born, it only matters if you're born again. Iron and clay cannot adhere except in here. But the mentality of Babylon is build the tower. They have to try to make different peoples and cultures congeal the way Rome did. And they will go about it the same way pagan Rome tried it. Pagan Rome, sexual pluralism. Homosexuality and bisexuality were culturally endemic. They were normative expressions of sexuality. Today in San Francisco, California, they teach kids in the public schools that taxpayers pay for to read books. Danny's two daddies, Maria's two mummies, 6 and 7 years old. If anybody doesn't believe in Christian schools, they don't have their head examined. That's what it was like in Rome. That's what it's like now. The same scenario comes back. Also, a culture of violence. Entertainment. Violent entertainment was a distraction from the political, social, and economic crisis that plagued Rome continually. At one time, you could see a movie where if you saw a cowboy movie, a gunfight at OK Corral, the violence was there only as something derivative from a plot. Okay? The violence was derivative from a plot, a story. Now, Hollywood movies, the stories only exist so you can see people being blown up and shot. It's like the gladiators. It's a culture of violence, where violence is glorified. Now, the Bible deals with life for what it is. It deals with violence, but it never glorified it. Culture of violence is entertainment. Book of Proverbs warns about that. Point. An integration of science with superstition in the ancient world, and it came from the Greeks initially. In fact, it dated back to the Babylonians, but under the Greeks it blossomed and was formalized. In the ancient world, going back to Greco-Roman civilization with roots in Babylon, science and the occult were the same thing. Astrology and astronomy, the same thing. Magic and chemistry, the same thing. Healing arts, medical science, and folk medicine, the same thing. What you have now is what you had then. A rapprochement between science and the occult. With the Enlightenment, it split. Astronomy as a quantitative science went that way. Astrology with superstition, that went that way. Medicine and pharmacology went that way. Folk medicine went that way. Chemistry and physics went that way. Alchemy and magic went that way. It split. Now you have a rapprochement between science and the occult. And you will see it in three fields particularly. You will see it in computer video graphics, computer science. You'll see it in particle physics and holistic medicine. Watch out. It will come to microbiology and genetics, where they'll be using cloning to facilitate reincarnation, or attempting to do that. A rapprochement between science and the occult, the same as you had in the Greco-Roman world. We deal with this on our tape just as it was in the days of Noah. Obsession with materialism and a permanently fixed underclass. For all this to go, the Romans had to keep an underclass. 25% of the population were slaves. I wish slavery in America ended with the Emancipation of Proclamation, but it did not. Just look what's happened to the black people of America. Black liberation and upward mobility always came from Christianity. Martin Luther King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. George Washington Carver was a Christian. Booker T. Washington was a Christian. The abolitionist movement in Britain and America were Christian. Now the black community, some have turned from Christ to crack. I was a cocaine addict at university, I know it. Others are turning to Islam radically. Forgetting the fact that the first countries to abolish slavery were Christian, the last ones to abolish it are Muslim, only they still have black slaves in much of Africa. Muslims own black slaves. Saudis buy, effectively, black slaves. In effect, that's what they are. Supposedly employment contracts made with the parents of little kids, but it's slavery. A fixed underclass today exists. Asians are relatively newcomers to America, but they're upwardly mobile. Hispanics are upwardly mobile and have now become the biggest minority in America, not black people. But you have affirmative action programs designed to keep the black man dependent on liberal politicians. They need a permanent underclass. They need to create a permanent underclass so the black people will not be upwardly mobile. Don't do what the Asians did. That's not the key to get ahead. Don't do it that way. Don't do what the Hispanics did. Don't do what the Jews did. Vote for us. We'll take care of you. Well, it hasn't worked and it's not going to work. But they have to keep a permanent underclass, otherwise people like Hillary Clinton can't get elected. Otherwise, Jesse Jackson will have to go out and get an honest job. Europe is the same. A designed integration. They have to push an intermarriage agenda. It won't work in the seed of men. In Christ, there's neither Jew or Gentile. Always remember, iron and clay will not adhere except in here. Point. But they have to try to make it happen. Let's see how they will try to make it happen. The way Europe will try to make it happen, and the way America is imitating, is the same way pagan Rome did it when they made Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. At different times in history, you had one predominant power who brought a relative peace and stability. In the age of empire, it was Pax Britannica. In the 20th century into the 21st century, Pax Americana, but the first was Pax Romana of the New Testament era. Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. How can we build this union that will create a relative peace, a relative stability, and a relative prosperity? The first thing they needed was a common market. Take down all trade barriers, customs and excise goes, we'll have a common market. You wind up exporting jobs, creating instability at home, doesn't matter. We have to have free trade. Now, I believe in free trade personally, but I also realize what's happened in Europe is not about free trade. It's about the has-been complex. Can we go ahead, please? I'll come back to this one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. East goes west, west goes east. Eastern Europe, whoops, take it back, please. Eastern Europe had an unelected socialist bureaucracy. That was the Soviet Empire. What was rejected by Eastern Europe has now come west. Europe is effectively being ruled more and more by an unelected socialist bureaucracy in Brussels. They're socialists. Led by such figures as someone mentioned, Javier Solano of Spain. An unelected socialist bureaucracy. Rejected by Eastern Europe, now being embraced by Western Europe. Eastern Europe rejected multinational federalism. It rejected multinational federalism. The federal states of Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, all broke up, sometimes in bloody conflict. What was rejected by Eastern Europe, Western Europe is now embracing. A United States of Europe, trying to make the iron stick to the clay. And the abject ideology, the bankrupt ideology, is made sacrosanct. If you don't agree with this, you don't believe in brotherhood and unity. And they even say, if you don't believe in a federal Europe, you're not a true Christian. That's what they're saying now. It goes hand in hand with the ecumenical agenda. East has gone west, west goes east. Now, you did have one federal state in Western Europe. That was Britain. But it's also breaking up in Britain. Now, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales have their own parliaments. We'll come back to that in a moment. Could we go back, please, to where we were? Pax Romana, a common market. Second, a common currency, the euro. There is not a lot of difference in market value between the euro and the US dollar. The Fed and the Bush administration has let the dollar weaken greatly. It hasn't really helped exports all that much, except the export of American jobs abroad, but that's what they've done. Once the euro and the US dollar achieve parity, or achieve parity by international agreement, you will effectively have a one world currency. The British pound, the Swiss franc, Japanese yen won't matter. If 1 US dollar equals 1 euro, you'll have a one world currency. Everything else will have to follow suit. There's already IMUs, international monetary units, used to denominate certain kinds of instruments by the World Bank and by the IMF. A common infrastructural standard. No more British standards or French standards. That plug and what you put into the wall in that outlet, you have to have the same one in Italy that you can use in Britain. And the one you use in Britain has to fit also in Denmark. We have to integrate the infrastructure. That is exactly what Rome did with their roads, their postal network, their postal rates. You need an integrated common infrastructure. Again, they're trying to imitate the United States, they think, but they're really imitating Rome. You need a lingua franca. Why do they need Britain in Europe? First of all, because Germany's bankrupt and they need the British economy. It's the most healthy left in Europe. But they need the English language. I've spoken English in Badening, China, not Shanghai and Beijing, I mean out in the middle of nowhere. I was crossing a bridge on the Zambezi River in the middle of Black Africa. Nobody but me and the crocodiles. I see a little kid, a little black kid, just me, him, and the baboons. And the kid asked me, where are you from in English? And I said, England. And he begins telling me the name of all the Manchester United football soccer players in England. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Out in the middle of nowhere. Why do you think it is that people in Britain, Australia, and America don't speak foreign languages too often? And my family is an exception. We do, but most families don't. Why? Everybody had to learn our language. English-speaking people have dominated the world economically and politically for 300 years. The lingua franca. Then it was Greek. Now it is English. Point. Pax Romana was achieved by pseudo-democracy and subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, you can make local decisions, but the Parliament of Europe is merely a consultative body. It has no real congressional or parliamentary power. That is exactly what happened to the Senate of Rome, a pseudo-democratic institution. The real decisions in Europe are made on back of closed doors by unelected bureaucrats nobody voted for and can't remove, similar to the U.S. Supreme Court. An integrated military. That's what Rome had. They need to uncouple NATO. In other words, they want America to pay for Europe's defense, so they don't want to get rid of America, but they want to get rid of America. Well, if they could say, leave the money and go home, that's what they would say. The Cold War was won by the American taxpayer, not by them. America spent more to defend Britain, more to defend Europe, than Europe did. NATO has been the biggest ripoff of the American taxpayer. They never paid their way. Under Clinton, something happened. Clinton, Bush, General Wesley Clark, and Javier Solano did something outrageous. Everybody's talking about the illegality of going into Iraq without a UN mandate. The NATO charter says NATO cannot attack a country unless they attack a NATO country. Yet in complete violation of the NATO charter, completely illegal, Bush, Clark, Solano, and Blair went to Yugoslavia, and while I have no admiration for the Serbs, they were no better than the others, and they effectively took the side of the Muslims who were aligned with Al-Qaeda. Clinton and Clark did that. An integrated military, a common foreign policy. Europe has to speak with one voice. And a common body of constitutional law. Their common body of constitutional law, the European Constitution being drafted and has been presented in its draft forms, is so vague in its wording, the decisions will have to be left to the interpretation of unelected magistrates in the European Court in Strasbourg. Sound familiar? Point. Sandra Day O'Connor said American Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, is taking its cues from Europe on certain issues. Nothing in the Constitution says that the judiciary should make social policy. Anytime the Supreme Court in this country has taken sides in a cultural war, it backed the wrong side, going all the way back to the Dred Scott decision, saying a black was subhuman. Roe versus Wade, a human embryo, contrary to all genetic argumentation, all genetic evidence, an embryo was subhuman. Things haven't changed much in the Supreme Court. And I mean, the Republicans have voted that way, the same as the Democrats. One of the few with any integrity has been a Catholic, ironically, Scalia. And so the courts will decide. Well, wait a minute. Congress shall not make any law concerning religion. We were not to have an Erastianism in America, a religion of the state like you had in Europe. That's all that meant. Anyone reading the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution and its preamble would know that the men who wrote it were theists. They believe in God. Going back to the tradition of the Puritans, the first constitution in America was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. What did it mean? We have to be governed by men who are governed by biblical principles, Judeo-Christian principles. To interpret the law in its context, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are endowed by their Creator. That is the premise of American democracy. How can anybody in their right mind say, that means you can't talk about God? When the preamble of the foundation document is based on the presupposition there is one. We are going into judicio-fascism. The American Supreme Court is a judicio-fascist institution, and it is copying it from Europe. Europe, to make the iron stick to the clay, needs corpus juris and a Europol. Again, east goes west, west goes east. Europol, the European police, you cannot serve a search warrant to get their records. No freedom of information. More than that, you cannot file civil suits for human rights or civil rights abuses against Europol, according to European law. They are above the law, a political police of the state. What does this sound like? J. Edgar Hoover with nobody to stop him. It is the KGB. What the KGB was in Mother Russia, you're getting in Western Europe. Only it's paired with corpus juris. Corpus juris is not our idea of innocent to proven guilty. It's based more on the Napoleonic Code of France. Guilty until proven innocent. We can put you in detention. What else did Pax Romana have? A Pontificus Maximus, the great bridge builder. They called him the Pontiff for short. I would have called him Max. They called him Pontiff instead of Pontificus Maximus. That was his title. Under Pax Romana, you could have any religion you wanted, as all providing you also bowed your knee to the emperor, who was the pontiff, the bridge builder between all faiths. What happened in Assisi, Italy, that Roger's been talking about? Pope meets with the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama says there's no God. I saw him on TV in South Africa, interviewed. He speaks pretty good English. He says, unlike Christians and Jews, we don't believe there's a creator. But we can still be one with Christians and Jews by closing our eyes together and meditating about things like peace. Although he says there's no God, he allows himself to be worshipped as a reincarnation of the Buddha. A man worshipped as God, that is Antichrist. And the Pope calls him a great leader, and Coulson sings the praises of the Pope. You get in bed with the Pope, he's in bed with the Dalai Lama. They're both in bed with the Antichrist because they're both Antichrist. Where does it end? Pax Romana. We need a unity of religions. That was the Roman pantheon. Roman Catholicism is by nature eclectic. They would just go in and say, you have the pagan god of gift giving, that's St. Nicholas. You have the pagan god of love, that's St. Valentine. Who's this? Diana of Ephesus, that's Hail Mary, full of grace. Ave Maria, Tree, it's good to see you. They need a cultural pluralism. But ultimately, they will need to facilitate that cultural pluralism of Caesar, and they will get one. Because they must make the iron adhere to the clay. Let me explain why. Point. In Europe, you have the has-been complex. The has-been complex. France knows the language of the new economy is English on the internet. The second language of the internet is Chinese. A generation ago, you could have spoke France in most of Africa. Now everybody wants to know English. They have an inferiority complex. They know the Anglo-American accent won World War I, they know the Anglo-American alliance won World War II, and they know the Anglo-American alliance won the Cold War and went to the moon and dominate the new economy in biogenetic engineering and information technology. There a has-been. Germany was the cultural capital of Europe. It is a has-been. There has-beens. So the philosophy of Europe is this. If all the has-beens get together and pool our resources, we can be a somebody again. Britain was the exception. Britain, because of its special relationship with the United States, still had power and influence. Although it was playing second fiddle to its American cousin, at least it was still in the orchestra. Look at Iraq. The French don't like it. If we go into Iraq, France will complain. Who cares? Germany doesn't like it. Who cares? What did the British think? Why? Iron does not stick to clay, but iron sticks to iron. Australia, America, Britain, don't think of NATO. The real cornerstone of international military alliance is the National Security Administration in Fort Meade, Maryland, aligned with British GCHQ, satellite intelligence gathering. That is much more important than NATO. You don't hear it talked about much, but it's much more important. Much more. America can survive without NATO. It cannot survive without GCHQ. It cannot survive without Pine Bluffs, Australia, or Cheltenham, England, or Menwith Hill, England, and vice versa. In Britain, you have New Labour and Old Labour. Old Labour are the old socialists. Blair is the New Labour. Why would Blair go against the Old Labour and against much of the public opinion in Britain and against the Islamic population of Britain and go in with Bush? It doesn't matter if it's a liberal or a Labour or conservative. Iron adheres to iron. Just think of the Falklands War, a huge Hispanic population in the United States. Except for Chile, every country in Latin America was pro-Argentinian. Big Hispanic vote in America. Why did America offend its neighbors and even alienate some of its own Hispanic population to back Britain? Iron sticks to iron. You can't change it. Countries that have always been antagonistic always will be. And countries that have always been friends will always tend towards that. It's anthropology? No, it's scripture. It's more than anthropology. But they have to make the iron and clay stick together. So how will they try to do it? How are they trying? Well, what are the obstacles? The first is biblical Protestantism. I live in England. Celts and Anglo-Saxons have never gotten along. They don't even like each other. You see the rivalries at the football games, the soccer games, rugby matches. They don't even like each other. But the reason Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England lined up was a common fear of the Pope. The reason Bonnie Prince Charles was defeated in the Battle of Culloden by the English is because the Scottish Presbyterians fought with the English against the Highlanders of Scotland because they didn't want a Catholic king. Biblical Protestantism was what made the United Kingdom united. Now that Europe is post-Christian, neo-pagan, now that Britain has lost sight of its biblical heritage, the United Kingdom is fragmenting. America is going the same way. The trends that happened in Britain 25 years ago are coming here now. Post-Christian, neo-pagan. Point. Nationalism. Well, we can deal with Protestantism with the ecumenical movement and with theological liberalism. But the next obstacle to a federal Europe is nationalism. We'll deal with this by subsidiarity, ecumenism, and a historical appeal to the Holy Roman legacy, plus a system of regionalization where your regional government will determine more what happens to you than the national government. It's a designed integration to try to make the iron and clay stick together, but it won't work. Pope John Paul II has stated he wants to see one Europe from the Urals to the Atlantic with one church. The nation state was born in the aftermath of the Reformation. And the Reformation was born out of the aftermath of the nation state. They both came when feudalism was replaced by capitalism, at the embryo of the Industrial Revolution that followed the Renaissance, when the printing press was invented and so forth. Before that, it was the Holy Roman Empire. The Pope could always stop the spread of the gospel then. He could persecute the Waldensians in Europe, or the Bohemian Brethren in Eastern Europe, or he could persecute the Lollards in Britain. He could always stop the evangelical Christians. But once the nation state was born, people said, I'm Scottish, I'm French, I'm German. The Pope no longer had the centralized control. Hence the Vatican wants what it once had before the Reformation. People like Luther and Zwingli, they only lived to tell about things that other people tried previously and were killed for. There were people like Jonas Hus, 100 years before Luther, and Wycliffe in England, hundreds of years before Luther, were trying to get back to the Bible, but the Pope could always stop it. Once the nation state was born, he couldn't, hence the nation state will go. Rome has its own reason for wanting, back please, Rome has its own reason for wanting a federal Europe. But a federal Europe has its own reason for wanting the ecumenical movement. What is it? Think of Europe. What does somebody in Ireland, somebody in Spain, somebody in Poland, and somebody in Austria have in common? It's certainly not cuisine. It's certainly not language. It's certainly not culture. What is the only thing somebody in Ireland, somebody in Poland, somebody in Austria, and somebody in Spain has in common? In nomine Patri cum Filio cum Spiritus Sancto. That's it. You understand? It's a political agenda. They need the ecumenical Europe to reintegrate Europe. It serves the interest of the Vatican to extend its tentacles theocratically, and it serves the interest of the Europeans, Euro-federalists, to abolish the nation state in its present form. Next obstacle was Fortress Britannia. Britain always opposed it. Other people tried to, can we put that back please? Other people tried, this doesn't control it, does it? Oh, I thought it was a pointer. Back when it was. Other people tried to federalize Europe. Napoleon tried to resurrect the Roman Empire. He was opposed by Britain. Mussolini tried to resurrect the Roman Empire. He was opposed by Britain. We've got to stop Britain. Protestant Britain has always been the obstacle. So now, there has to be an abolition or diminution of the monarchy. In better times, there might be a republican, but the monarchy is a symbol of British sovereignty. Next is proportionate representation. An electoral system that's a disaster for any country that has it, including Israel and including Germany. The Liberal Democrats of Britain want proportional representation. In other words, there's no congressman or member of parliament from your district. What is it? Proportion. You get 26% of the votes, you get 26% of the seats. They call it the politics of consensus. In other words, decisions on how the country is run is made by politicians in back of closed doors. You want my 5 seats or my 16 seats in the parliament? You give me this, 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 and this. They call it the politics of consensus. It effectively abolishes democracy in the sense of a popular mandate from the electorate. It doesn't work in Germany. It's made a mess of Israel. And that's what they want in Britain and in Europe. Then they must destroy the special relationship with the USA. That is how Britain continued to have power and influence in the post-war era. They're saying for Britain to be great again, it has to leave America and its Commonwealth and come in full communion with Europe, with the other has-beens. A breakup of the Union facilitated by a post-Christian culture and resurgent tribalism. And again, you see the tribalism in the soccer games like you wouldn't believe. Point. Objection to forfeiture of democratic rights. How are we going to stop people from agreeing to give up their rights? The same reason when you go to the airport in Phoenix, you have to take your shoes off and show up an hour and a half early than you used to. We can't offend the Muslims anymore. Now, the common sense thing would be to security profile Muslims the way El Al does. But of course, Bush won't do that. In fact, photographic ID, they don't even want to take their Bikur off for a photograph. It's because of them we have a terror threat, but no, you can't have my photograph. This is against my religion. I have a right to. That's what they're saying now. I know what I would do. Take off the Bikur, I'll take your head off with it. I'll do in my country what you do to Christians in yours. You like that?
That's right. That's right.
They amplify the terror threat to get people to agree to forfeit rights. Then there's the drug epidemic. Then there's the need for a common environmental policy. Well, we can't control pollution in our country when you have rivers. The Danube flows through all these countries. How can you possibly control pollution without a multinational government? And a policy to control the Russian mafia. The Russian mafia is much more dangerous than the triads of Hong Kong, much more dangerous than the traditional American mafia or the Irish mobs. It's much worse than anything like that. It's worse than the Colombian drug gangs. I will tell you why it's worse. 99% of the Russian mafia are former KGB agents. They're not thugs. They're not Tony Sopranos. These are educated, trained spies. They know everything about foreign languages, about computer technology, about infiltration into business systems. And it's very big in Europe. It even exists in America. So you get people to agree, we have to stop the mafia, we have to control terror. People will give up their freedom. Point. East goes west, west goes east. What used to be in Russia is coming to Europe and vice versa. Point. The has-beens cum wannabes. The new Europe or the Slavic states, they are still relatively pro-American. People in Poland and Czechoslovakia know they would still be under Soviet dominion had America not stood up to the Soviets. Now, some of them also know that Roosevelt handed Eastern Europe to the Soviets on a silver platter at Yalta against the wishes and advice of Churchill. But they are still relatively pro-American. Then we have the Balkan states. Yugoslavia is where the Roman Empire fragmented between the Greek-speaking East and the Latin West. And it's also where the Saracen and the Muslim invasions came. It was a center of conflict. The first center of conflict in the Crusades was there. World War I began there, Sarajevo, Bosnia. Giovello Princip assassinated by the assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. It was a quagmire. It is this point of conflict between the Roman Catholic world, the Greek Orthodox world, and the Islamic world. These are the clay, the weak bits of Europe. Point. The old Europe, France and Germany, want power again. Pay attention. If the German left, who were against Iraq and against America, if Schroeder's people had their way, the Berlin Wall would still be standing. They were opposed to America deploying cruise missiles against the Soviet SS-20s when the Soviets pointed SS-20s at Western Europe. If they had their way, they'd still be living under the communists. Germany would still be divided. If the French left had their way, the Cold War would not be over. 400 million people would still be living under the Soviet Empire. 420 million approximately altogether. Germany, the German left, the same. France, the same. Britain, they're called the Chamberlainists, the Neo-Chamberlainists. Appeasement, peace at any price. If they had their way, fortunately, Thatcher had her way, and the Berlin Wall came down. If the German left, the same German and French and British left who are knocking at Bush in America, and I'm no fan of Bush, if they had their way, the Cold War never would have been won. Point. Mediterranean Europe is in the middle, but it's still part of the iron. Russia is a has-been. Russia would love to get into the EU, but it was never part of the Roman Empire. However, the Vatican was. The Vatican is the natural heir to the papal states. The Vatican, the Catholic Church, has lost moral credibility, it's lost religious vocations, it's lost mass attendance. The Vatican is in big trouble. Catholicism is declining rapidly in Latin America because of evangelical revivals, for better or worse. What Rome has lost numerically and in terms of credibility, it is gaining politically and through ecumenism. A has-been who wants to be. Point. That's it. What does this come to? They are desperate to make a United States of Europe. They are desperate to make the iron adhere to the clay, not knowing that Antichrist will be the Caesar they're looking for. Not knowing. They want to play a role in the Middle East and replace the role traditionally played by America. That's the aim. They want to be a superpower. The has-beens want to be somebody again. So the only way the has-beens can do it is to combine their technology, economies, resource base, populations, and market. Go back to Pax Romana, thinking they'll have peace. But they won't have peace. They'll have disaster. A godless Antichrist system, pioneered under the tutelage of the Vatican in major part. And then this becomes a major factor in what will happen in the Middle East. But how will it end? Zechariah 12 tells me how the conflict in the Middle East will end. Daniel 2 tells me how federal Europe will end. The rabbis have always agreed. Who is this stone cut from the mountain? Not made or not cut by human hands. They have always said it is the Mashiach, the Messiah. They'll combine with one another, but they'll not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Some will be strong, some of these countries will be weak. Countries like Poland and Malta will never have a say the way Italy or France or Germany do. But in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but itself will endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron and the bronze, the clay and the silver and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. Notice where that stone, cut without human hands, strikes. It strikes the iron and the clay. And then all the world empires collapse with it. Yes, I know what the EU is coming to. Satan has his role, Antichrist. God has his role, the return of Christ. The European Union is doomed. Not because of any man, but because of the stone cut without human hands. We'll smash it, never to recover. Replacing this Antichrist kingdom with the kingdom that will endure forever. As we speak, the stage is being set. Jesus is coming soon. God bless.
That was tremendous. We're going to end this evening. We hope you have a nice evening. We're going to end in prayer. We're going to end with an invitation for anybody.